Hello YouTube, welcome back to Seltzertronics. I'm the Seltzertron. Today we have an exciting but controversial subject, the battle of the premium tier streaming services currently offered here in North America. That would be Tidal, the reigning champ if only for lack of competition, and a new challenger in the form of Qobuz, a French company which has been streaming in Europe for some time now but is only now rolling out service in the New World. Now, I wish this was going to be a simple video, but we're necessarily going to have to get heavy into some controversial topics, since the question of Qobuz versus Tidal is really just the front end of ongoing debates about the merit of MQA, or Master Quality Authenticated, and the merit of high resolution generally. Both Tidal and Qobuz claim to be superior to the competition, not only because they offer lossless CD quality streams, but also growing catalogs of so-called high-resolution music. To this end, they adopt very different approaches, which I will discuss later. So what is high resolution? A Japanese electronics consortium has attempted to define certain industry standards to bear that label. But that never really caught on, and for all practical conversation, high resolution refers to digital audio that exceeds the CD standard of 16-bit samples 44,100 times per second, or 1644 for short. The DVD standard for audio is 48 kilohertz for totally unrelated reasons, so I generally say anything greater than 1648. Does it matter? Well, the long answer is that it shouldn't matter. Sony and Philips really did their homework in the 1970s when they were developing the CD. Now, it's true that data and computation were much more expensive in those days, and they were working with much stricter limitations than today. But 1644 wasn't just the best they could do. Rather, these numbers were chosen because they were the smallest values that still exceeded the limitations of human hearing. The bit depth, 16, determines the noise floor, and by extension, the maximum difference between the quietest and loudest sounds, or the dynamic range. 16 bits yields a dynamic range of 96 decibels, which is plenty for any sonic experience you ever want to be a part of. The sampling rate, 44.1 kilohertz, determines the maximum frequency that can be sampled and played back. The Nyquist theorem proves that any frequency can be perfectly recorded as long as the sampling rate is at least twice its value. Thus, a rate of 44.1 kilohertz will allow us to capture all frequencies up to 22 kilohertz. Now, for reference, a young child might hear 20 kilohertz or so, but you're probably not hearing much more than 17 to 18 kilohertz, even as young as the age of 17, 18, or 19. Now, it's worth noting that there is very, very little musical information up there anyway. Music is made with instruments designed by humans to be heard with human ears. The music is produced by human musicians that listen to what they play with their own human ears. If you watch frequency spectrographs carefully, you'll notice that as much as 95% of the music is below 12 kilohertz. So that's the long answer to the question of whether high resolution matters. The short answer is, I personally don't think so. I've attempted more blind ABX tests than I can count, taking great care in the selection of high-res and CD quality files suitable for comparison, including the test tracks developed by Mark Waldrop at his studio specifically for this purpose. That is, files recorded at high resolution with measurable high-resolution content compared with downsampled CD quality versions with the high-resolution component simply lopped off. Now, that being said, I still generally prefer high resolution for two reasons. First, and most importantly, high resolution releases are often more dynamic masterings. This has been especially welcome for material originally released at the height of the so-called loudness wars of the 80s and 90s. In order to make music sound louder at the same spot on the volume dial, mastering engineers would boost the amplitude near the max to like minus 4 dB or so, but often didn't do this linearly. To make it even louder, they would boost the quieter sounds even more, resulting in dynamic compression and the brick wall appearance of the waveform. Now, this also had the benefit of helping music sound good in noisy environments like bars and clubs and in moving cars. However, it came at the price of making music sound like garbage in more ideal listening circumstances like hi-fi. More recently, we've seen the folly of this, and high-resolution re-releases of old, much-loved albums, remastered with less dynamic compressions, helps sell high resolution because they often do, in fact, sound better. It may not be for the stated reasons, but better nonetheless. The second reason why I prefer high resolution is more a moral and philosophical principle. Even if I can't hear the difference, it's an unquestionable fact that it's superior in a technical sense. High resolution is better. Look, musicians made beautiful art. Is it not reasonable to treat that art with care extending well beyond the absolute minimum of what we must do in order to preserve it? High resolution allows us to capture and preserve musicians' creations with greater fidelity, such that every little piece of their creation, every inaudible overtone and harmonic, is perfectly preserved. I mean, we give extra special, even unnecessary care for all sorts of things we care about, from paintings to sculptures to baseball cards. So why give the minimum for music? Besides, just because we can't hear the difference today doesn't mean that we should settle for good enough. Perhaps scientists in the future will want to analyze our music, and that high-resolution information will be interesting to them. Perhaps we'll have bionic ears that hear better in the future. Perhaps, well, we'll be long gone, but alien anthropologists will be interested in our music, and perhaps their hearing is better than ours. My point is, preserve what's there. Preserve what's there, preserve it as perfectly as we can. So as I mentioned before, Qobuz and Tidal have taken different approaches to high resolution, and therefore the question of Qobuz versus Tidal will inevitably touch upon that debate. Now, Tidal has elected for an approach to high resolution called MQA, or Master Quality Authenticated. MQA is a non-standard proprietary algorithm for encoding PCM data. The owners of MQA, MQA Limited, claim that MQA is the superior approach for two main reasons. First, it achieves high resolution using less data, saving on data storage and bandwidth costs. Now, this may not be a huge deal for home users with effectively unlimited high-speed internet connections, but it can really make a difference to the bottom line for providers who are streaming music out to millions of subscribers. Now, standard lossless codecs like FLAC, IF, or ALEC approach the Shannon limits of information density. These are mathematically determined and inviolable. You literally cannot decrease the size of a PCM audio file smaller than an aggressively encoded FLAC by any more than the tiniest smidge. MQA, however, sails right past those limits, achieving file sizes half or even a quarter the size of a comparable FLAC. Thus, we should be absolutely clear. MQA is a lossy codec, but this needs to be taken in context. It's important to understand that MQA is only lossy in the high-resolution component, while remaining lossless in the portion up to CD quality. As has been shown countless times, under truly blind conditions, people are only able to discern high bitrate lossy codecs like 320 kilobit per second Ogg Vorbis, AAC, and even MP3 from lossless under the most ideal listening circumstances. Now, there is simply no night and day difference. If you say there is, then this is a telltale sign of the placebo effect or expectation bias. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. So if we can barely tell the difference between lossy and lossless in the portion of the music that is actually audible, how proficient do you expect we will be at discerning the difference in the portion that isn't even audible in the first place? Now, MQA claims to have captured whatever, if anything, is to be the sonic benefit of high resolution. Maybe it's the ability to apply different sorts of filters or some benefits in the time domain. I don't know. While at the same time discarding the ultrasonic information that uses a lot of data and also doesn't contribute to the sound quality of the track. Secondly, MQA Limited argues that MQA fixes so-called temporal blurring, or timing errors that occur during the analog to digital and digital back to analog cycle. Of the two main purported benefits of MQA, this one is almost certainly the more important. It's also the most difficult to talk about. You see, nobody outside of MQA Limited really knows how this works. As I mentioned, MQA is a closed source and proprietary codec. From the consumer's perspective, it's a black box, the inner workings of which we can only speculate upon. MQA has published no compelling evidence that such temporal blurring actually exists, if at all, in a meaningful quantity to cause problems for audio. Importantly, this deblurring only occurs at the rendering stage of a multi-stage MQA unfolding process, whereas the first unfold takes place in software and expands resolutions up to 96 kilohertz. The final stages, generating the highest resolution and fixing the temporal blurring, only occur with MQA-compatible hardware. The net result of the two benefits, according to MQA, is what the mastering engineer heard in the studio. Qobuz, on the other hand, takes the conventional approach to high-resolution audio. Just good old-fashioned high-resolution PCM packed into a flat container. They also seem to offer much, or possibly even more, of the same high-resolution content that Tidal does in resolutions up to 24/192. And this has numerous technical advantages over MQA. Notably, Qobuz's lossless FLAC is actually lossless. For example, while MQA claims 24 bits of depth, this is never actually achieved since the last 5 to 7 bits are used for storing lossy, high-resolution information in some unknown way. Further, whereas MQA's closed-source proprietary nature makes it incompatible with any kind of digital signals processing, or DSP, OpenFLAC is completely compatible with DSP and equalization, or digital equalization. This is especially important for people who use some kind of digital processing for room correction, like owners of a mini DSP or a ARC or Dirac Live room correction system. So now the part you've probably all been waiting for, the sound comparison. I compared Tidal's MQA and Qobuz's lossless PCM using Roon as my software player, running on a laptop connected to my iFi Micro ISD Black Label DAC with MQA-enabled version 5.30C firmware. MQA's core decoding is handled by Roon, while the render stage is completed on the iFi, as it is a renderer only. The iFi fed my Audio GD HE9 as a preamp to my Sonus Faber Venere 3.0 speakers, driven by Schiit Vidar monoblock amplifiers. I repeated these tests again using my Schiit Gungnir multi-bit DAC, which does not have the ability to decode or render MQA. However, Roon still completed the first unfold up to 96 kilohertz. I compared 8 tracks in a variety of resolutions, including 44.1, 96, and 192 kilohertz that were available on both Tidal and Qobuz. These included tracks from Ariana Grande's latest, 2 tracks from an older and a newer Jack Johnson album, Van Morrison, Kacey Musgraves, The Cars, J.S. Ondara, and Nirvana. I chose these in order to include a variety of sample rates, but also recent recordings, some conceived long before MQA, and some which were originally recorded on analog tape. One factor that I cannot fully account for is that the MQA versions may be different masterings. Now, I sort of doubt this because high-resolution PCM and MQA versions of an album tend to be released at the same time in the same resolutions. It also seems unlikely that MQA could somehow have a secret special master all of its own every single time. Thus, I tentatively assume they are from comparable masterings and the only difference is standard PCM or MQA. Ultimately, however, nobody knows because of the secretive nature of MQA. Each track was compared on the iFi Micro IDSD with MQA rendering and on the Gungnir without MQA rendering, giving a total sample size of 16. All comparisons were completely blind. In each trial, either the Tidal or Qobuz version of the track was labeled A or B. I listened to each track, switched back and forth as desired until I was able to express a preference for A or B. I'm utterly shocked to report that in all 16 cases, I preferred the MQA. Not 14 of 16, not 15 of 16, but all 16. For you statistics nerds out there, that's a p-value of less than 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. 0.00001. This included both with and without MQA rendering on both the MQA-compatible iFi and the non-MQA Gungnir. Although the test was perhaps a little bit more challenging on the Gungnir, leaving me somewhat less confident in my answers, they were still, nevertheless, MQA every single time. Now, let me say that the differences are subtle and may not be audible at all, depending on a lot of variables in the listening environment. These are my subjective preferences, and they could be different from yours. Remember, I was merely identifying the one that I preferred. It's entirely possible that you could prefer the other. Now, I'm certainly not saying the FLAC sounded bad, but for me, the MQA was just a bit better, and importantly, in systematic, repeated ways. Most notably, the soundstage was perceptibly more natural, creating a far more holophonic experience. I conducted half the tests under daylight and was literally blindfolded. In a way, the MQA was reminiscent of that all-over, immersed in the music, the universe's music sensation experienced when listening to music under the influence of some legally obtained smokable substance that shall remain nameless. At the same time, the FLAC seemed compressed inwards somehow in the soundstage. The FLAC was not fully expressed spatially. The spatial nature of these results is consistent with some kind of time domain-based explanation, supporting MQA's claims of temporal blur. As well, in most of the tracks, I noted a slight improvement in timbre, being just a touch more realistic in the MQA, and a touch drier in the FLAC. This held true in both the rendered and unrendered comparison. One difference I only managed to pick up in the fully rendered comparison is that the MQA seemed to have slightly improved clarity. This was apparent in, say, the strumming of a guitar, where the individual sound of each string kinds of blends together. With the MQA, there was just a bit more definition between them. Overall, I can summarize these differences as being much like the differences you realize when you get a significant DAC upgrade. Better timbre, better sense of space, more clarity and resolution, especially in the low-level details. In a way, it was as if MQA helped my little iFi perform at a level above its pay grade. These differences consistently emerged as the bases for my preference of A or B. However, I once again want to emphasize that while they were impactful and regular enough for me to choose MQA 16 out of 16 times, we're still talking about very subtle differences here. Thus, whatever benefits of MQA exist over standard PCM must be weighed against the inability to do DSP, which can be enormous with advanced room correction tools like Dirac. Underlying this debate is more than just audio quality. Many, including myself, hold philosophical opposition to closed proprietary platforms. MQA critics frequently describe MQA as DRM'd, or being subject to digital rights management. This is not entirely accurate, as MQA files can still be copied, distributed freely, and will play on any device capable of playing FLAC, even without the presence of any MQA software or hardware decoding. However, it will only play at CD quality, as its true potential remains locked behind MQA paywalls. So it may be fair to say that it's quasi-DRM'd. One argument MQA proponents often make is that MQA is in fact good for the recording industry, which is by extension good for artists and good for us. The proprietary nature of MQA is said to put the music industry, at least partially, back in the distribution game, and to give them a stake in high-resolution music. While making music is inherently human, humans will always make music because that's just what we do. Giving the major record labels new skin in the game may entice them to invest more money into their artists and greater production value. More money for the recording industry probably implies more investment in actual recording, whereas these days artists are constantly touring to earn money. More money in recording could mean more time in the studio making new music. With that in mind, it isn't clear that MQA is the answer the recording industry is looking for. You see, Qobuz is more than just a streaming service. Qobuz also sells music. In fact, Qobuz's biggest advantage may be that Sublime package subscribers also enjoy substantial discounts on digital downloads, in some cases nearly 50%. If you're into buying music, it's hard not to justify Qobuz on that point alone. I mean, MQA may argue that they're the best for the industry, but ultimately, they're more about streaming, at least at this point. Qobuz is actually in the business of selling music, that is, putting real money into artists' pockets. To sum up, choosing between Tidal and Qobuz comes down to some really hard choices. Based on my blind comparison, I'm forced to the conclusion that MQA probably sounds better, but at the expense of open, non-proprietary standards that are also important to me. I think I'll probably drop Tidal and adopt Qobuz. I will do this in part because I enjoy purchasing music and also because I'm only realizing maybe half of the benefits of MQA on my primary DAC. Notably, I was still better off with my Gungnir Multibit without MQA than the iFi Micro IDSD with MQA. If in the future I acquire a higher end MQA DAC, such as the Mytech Brooklyn DAC Plus or the PS Audio Direct Stream, which I will probably get for reasons other than MQA, I will almost certainly be switching back to Tidal. So there you have it. Please don't skewer me in the comments. For the record, I'm likely no happier about these results than you, but again, I feel confident in my testing protocol and am thus compelled to accept the conclusions, however inconvenient.